All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, of all the scenarios that I laid out this week about what could be on offer under 4 years of Biden or another 4 years of Trump, this one was maybe the most challenging for me to envision. What is the best case scenario for another 4 years of Donald J. Trump? Now, I should say that some leftists have a very clear answer to this. Some believe that another catastrophic loss by the neoliberal establishment to Donald Trump will force a reckoning within the party. After all, if the Democrats lose twice in a row to a man they have identified as a singular threat to the nation, surely there will have to be some reassessment, right? After having made one solid pledge and one solid pledge alone, which was that if we forgot about any policy goals and nominated Joe Biden, we would defeat Donald Trump, surely the failure to accomplish this extremely modest outcome would cause a significant segment of the party base to realize that neoliberalism has been a destructive force both economically and electorally. Since the only coherent alternative to the current neoliberal disaster is a Bernie Sanders-style democratic socialism, the left would be well positioned to hijack the hulking remains of that shattered party. Not to mention that if Joe loses, then the field is wide open in 2024 for a leftist to take another shot at the presidency. Now, I would actually like to believe this chain of events would occur. It's obviously very satisfying to imagine our political philosophy validated and neoliberal enemies vanquished in this way. I just can't bring myself to really believe that is what would occur. After all, there will never be a shock to the Democratic establishment system as grave as the one delivered when Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton. That was as big a gut punch as they could possibly ever take. Did they move left in response? Did they learn one single thing at all? No. Instead, actually, they became worse and moved further right, so that now the party is centered around a bunch of former Bush Republicans and led by the crime bill guy. The Democratic establishment blamed the left for the loss, saying that Bernie Sanders didn't do enough to win his supporters over and raged against the relatively small number of Jill Stein voters, rather than thinking, hey, maybe we need to do more to win these folks over. Instead, they launched a 4-year effort to shame and humiliate anyone who dared to criticize the Democratic establishment line. The Democratic establishment, backed by their enablers, convinced voters that Donald Trump was such a unique threat that they should vote in the primary with only one goal in mind, defeating Trump, and then informed those same voters that the man to get the job done was a fated Joe Biden. If Trump wins again, they will follow nearly exactly this same playbook. It will not be their fault, and certainly not a judgment on neoliberalism. It will be the fault, once again, of leftists. You can already imagine the enraging post-loss takes about how Bernie and AOC pulled Joe too far left, caused the party to be too closely associated with socialism. They'll argue that Trump's attack on Joe as a Trojan horse for socialism won the day, even though we know that those attacks have only improved Joe's favorability ratings. And if Joe Biden wasn't moderate enough, then God knows who they'll force down our throats next time with the media's help. Probably, and I'm not kidding, an actual Republican like a John Kasich or a Jeff Flake. So no, I don't think it's realistic to imagine that this time a real lesson would be learned by the Democrats. A second term of Trump will only further embolden their instincts of censorship, conspiracy, and their own brand of dissent-free authoritarianism. But there is one thing I think you could reasonably hope for in a second Trump turn: a massive stock market crash. Let me explain. Obviously, the idea that Trump is some kind of economic populist is hopelessly absurd at this point. The only thing that him or his team can articulate as a second-term agenda is tax cuts and deregulation. Trump has specifically made mention of the biggest plutocrat giveaway of all, a further cut to the capital gains rate. But there is one thing that he's responsive to that could cause him temporarily to stop listening to the Art Laffers and Mark Meadows and Larry Kudlows of the world, and that's if the stock market were to suffer a massive crash. Lord knows this is a significant possibility. Markets plunged yesterday while I was writing this radar. In fact, with no additional stimulus, millions of businesses, tens of millions of Americans have been pushed to the breaking point. What's more, major industries like the airline industry or anything travel related are not expected to be back to normal for years. But the stock market has seemingly marched relentlessly up and up and up, buoyed by the Fed's socialism for corporations. A major drop in the market could send Trump scurrying back to the negotiating table for another major round of stimulus. After all, the only thing that we have really seen Donald Trump responsive to his entire presidency is the damn stock market. And there's a good case to be made that if he did so, he could get a much larger deal than what Joe Biden could. Why? Well, We all know that the moment Joe Biden's elected, Republicans will be fully back into their complete deficit hawk mode and will not only be utterly unwilling to work with Joe on a stimulus, they will also start pushing for some new major deficit cutting. They may not fully go along even with Trump on another large stimulus, but he will be able to get a whole lot more out of them than Joe Biden would be able to. Rest of the term, well, I think the best we could hope for is that nothing as catastrophic as a global pandemic reoccurs, so that all of Trump's chaos and mess ends only in minor disasters rather than the multiple hundreds of thousands of people dead type of disaster that we're living through right now, for example. Trump hasn't really promised anything for a second term, but that means he hasn't really threatened anything for a second term either. Perhaps his chaos will be confined mostly to rhetoric, and he won't be called upon to actually govern again in the way that he has in 2020. Obviously, all of his associates and agency heads will continue looting the public purse and giving everything to corporate interests that they possibly can. With him once again dramatically defying the odds, Republicans of the fake populist variety with some working class rhetoric sprinkled on top of a typical corporatist agenda will likely be ascendant. The ugliness and cultural coming apart of the nation will naturally continue. And I just honestly can't imagine a second Trump turn without some level of significant social unrest. The best I could hope for in the current pandemic is that we continue to have the benefit of new death rate lowering therapeutics and enough Americans get an eventual vaccine that at least helps slow the spread. I know for certain, though, that with Trump at the helm, a large portion of the public is going to avoid taking the vaccine. And of course, climate change and environmental degradation will accelerate. Just this week, in fact, Trump announced he's going to strip protections from Tongass National Forest in Alaska, leaving open to logging on the largest temperate rainforest in the world. I'd like to buy that Trump would finally get us out of Afghanistan, but how can I credibly make that case when he's failed for 4 years to do it already? Meanwhile, Pompeo will at best continue dabbling in coups and at worst get us into some actual potential conflict. So, bottom line here is that from where I sit, even best case scenario Trump is not something that people on the left should be cheering for. But it could be less bad than Trump in 2020. Could be less bad than, say, George W. Bush flying us into war, creating a mass surveillance state, and torturing and committing various other atrocities. It's a low bar, I know. But with some luck, I do think that Trump could actually clear it. And that was the one, concrete thing that I could imagine. Because we sort of talked about it. I was like, well, maybe he'll get us out of the wars. And I was like, come on. Who are you fooling? If he's been here for 4 years and he hasn't done it and we're still in Afghanistan, you can't credibly say that it's going to be different this time around. But the one thing he did do is he signed off on the first stimulus when the stock market crashed. So maybe if the stock market crashes again, we could get an actual full stimulus in a second Trump term that would be meaningful to people.
It's possible. I definitely think, I think if he won, it definitely would happen. Because the thing is if he won, it would scramble everything for the GOP.
Yeah.
They still would fight him. Also, I don't know how the Senate is going to go. So look, if Trump does win, then that means polls are dramatically wrong. Most likely that the Republicans do keep the Senate. So in that scenario, they would still have, kind of the veto power necessarily on the deficit stuff. But I think that a newly reelected president, you could basically do whatever you want. I mean,
yeah.
And that was the same thing in 2017.
You get at least a little bit of political capital there.
You have a ton of, if he wins the biggest, polling miss since Dewey Truman 1948, he'll be, riding higher than he's ever been. Then I think the GOP does have to go along with what he does. But there's no evidence he necessarily wants more than $2 trillion. Remember, he only did it because he thought his reelection prospects were tied to it. So if he gets reelected, I'm not sure that comes. I actually think that would probably be more like a negotiated settlement, like a $1.5 trillion. Look, anything is better than nothing. I don't want to, crap on it. But I don't think it would be necessarily a $2.5 trillion. That being said, look, Dow Jones dropped 900 points yesterday. There's too much virus. There's not enough stimulus. People think that the reason why the market is dropping is because of stimulus. It's one of the few times where Trump is doing something to the contrary of what Wall Street actually wants. Wall Street's like, please give us stimulus.
Yeah.
Somebody give good consumers something.
That's why Mnuchin has weirdly turned into this good actor.
This is you can only keep markets propped up for so long before the entire economy runs out of money.
Yeah.
And when you run out of money, you stop spending. That causes an aggregate fall in all stock price, which all sell services to each other, which rely on us in order to buy things from other people. So, yeah, look, the case for Trump, like I said the other day, is all of the things of the negative, which is that hasn't stopped any wars, but it hasn't started any wars. Like,
Kept kind of close.
Yeah, he didn't do it. I mean, look, Obama actually did start new wars, and Biden actually probably will start new wars because all the people who worked for on Libya and all that other stuff.
I think I'm not willing
Susan
to give
Rice
him.
is literally his national security advisor.
Yeah,
Like,
I think
okay.
I'm not willing to give him as much credit on. I don't fundamentally see his foreign affairs approach, frankly, as that different from Joe Biden, which I know is a weird thing to say, but they're both very like gut players, sort of personality based. So yeah, I think Trump is a little better on Afghanistan in terms of willingness to negotiate with the Taliban. I think he's a little better on willingness to negotiate with North Korea, even though that ended up not really amounting to anything, being kind of a mess, but he's open to engagement. I think Biden will be better on Iran, and then Pompeo's out there, trying to foment maybe allegedly a coup in Venezuela. Like that stuff is going on in the Trump administration
is a
too.
contradiction in terms, and it has been since the very beginning. So in his gut, like if there's another Libya situation, I think Biden would probably go along with it because he loves Europe. And remember, the Europeans are the ones who forced us into that mess, and Obama's the one who got us in. I think Biden would probably go along. You're going to bring back Samantha Power and a bunch of like responsibility to protect nonsense of foreign intervention. Yeah, that's a disaster in my opinion.
But then in this administration, you had John Bolton.
Yeah,
and Mike Pompeo.
But
I'm just not.
We have 4 years, and he didn't start anything new, and like that is good enough for a lot of people. And I think that in general, the negative case for Trump, again, this is speaking from right perspective, is I'm not saying it's good, but it's a case. And I think that I think the left, the accelerationist case for Trump is also dumb. And I think that that's what you laid out.
Yeah,
from the left, because there are a bunch of secret leftists who are like, I just want Trump to win.
And look, I want to be clear. Yeah. You never know. I mean, this is all chaos theory.
Yeah, of course.
Right? Like, maybe it happens that Trump gets reelected and there's like this liberal meltdown and there's an opening and, leftists are able to say, like, it's possible. I think it's unlikely. It's out of pattern with what we've seen historically. I don't think you'll have a shock again like there was in 2016. And if their response that time was to move to the right, their response this time will probably be to move even further to the right. But you never know. I don't think that's a good reason to vote a certain way, though, because that's just not something you can predict. You just have to look at the facts in front of you, who these men have been, what they've done, what they've said they're going to do the next term, who you're looking at having in administrations, and make the best of, I think, what we both feel is not great choices at this point.
I think that's right.
Next on Rising, Purdue Pharma pled guilty to directly fueling this country's massive, devastating opioid crisis. Journalist Beth Macy discusses that $8 billion settlement when Rising returns.